And hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live on our first Tuesday of 2022. I had to think about that for a second. Nice to be with you tonight. We have a great show coming up with all the news that you've been talking about and hearing about everywhere else. But I wanted to say hello to David Pepper, the author of our book that we're discussing tonight. And as I quickly ruffle my feathers and my book here, title here is autocracy. Sorry, I'm just a bit of a mess right now. The what's the name of the book, David? Tell me again, because I'm just
Laboratories of Autocracy.
Thank you
Not
so
democracy.
much. Thank you. See, I got through that
Thank
first
you.
part. Now I'm going to relax and have a good time. Laboratories of Autocracy. Why did you call it that?
Well, for years, people sort of said, hopefully, that states would be laboratories of democracy. And sadly, in parts of our history, they haven't been, and they're certainly not being right now. They are, many of them are attacking democracy every single day.
Absolutely.
And I worry that we as we talked about, the last couple of days, when Orban does it, we figure it out. But when it's in our own states, we often don't see it. So I tried to go with a title that would wake people up to that reality.
It is true that we can sort of see everyone else's faults, but we have a very hard time seeing it ourselves. And that's because there is some strategy behind all of this. And that's what we're going to be talking about today is the mechanisms the Republican Party and all the other power brokers that make all this change, the mechanisms they've created really obscure a lot of the things that are going on in the country, and mostly on a state level, as you point out in your book. Why is the state level so important?
Well, one, go to the Constitution. States have a lot of power over our democracy, whether it's the Electoral College or drawing the districts for Congress or themselves or setting the rules of elections. It's an enormous amount of power. A lot of other countries don't operate that way, but here in America, that's the case. But the second part, as you hinted at, no one knows it. No one does. No one knows who their state reps are. They don't know what the people in that capital city do. So, to put a spin on that old Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great anonymity. And that's a dangerous combination. Like, they can do all these bad things. No one knows about it. No one knows who they are. Their elections are rigged, so they always get reelected, which if you are the Koch brothers or Alec or anybody who wants to do anti-democratic things, that's where you go. That's where it gets done. And the people who do it for you will get reelected. If they were a mayor or something, they probably would lose because a lot of things they're doing are deeply unpopular.
And as we'll show in just a few minutes, there's a mechanism as well to make us so distracted, whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene or Madison Cawthorn or even Sean Hannity. We get so distracted that we can't see a lot of the time that we're being that so much of the stuff is going on because there's so much distraction. But let's focus on that in just a minute. I do want to spend a minute here because it just dropped a short while ago, looking at the Sean Hannity letter. It's a letter sent from the January 6th committee to Sean Hannity. It's not a subpoena. It's a voluntary cooperation letter, which is interesting. In it, there's a lot of detail about how Hannity spoke to Mark Meadows, the chief of staff of the White House, of course, of the then White House, and to Donald Trump, but also saying things like, for example, on December 31st, 2020, you texted Mr. Meadows the following: "We can't lose the entire White House counsel's office. I do not see January the 6th happening the way he is being told. After the 6th, he should announce he will lead a nationwide effort to reform voting strategy." So that's incredible detail and very personal detail that is being released by the committee. And it's very rare, I would say, for an anchor of any news organization, whether you like them or not, it's still a news organization. It's very unusual for them to be delving into this territory because it is really the fourth estate, but the First Amendment. So what do you make of that? How concerning is that they're treading into these waters?
Well, one, it truly is bizarre. I've been in a number of offices. I know the media well. I've never seen anything like this. Like, no media, respected journalist would ever send you a letter about the strategy on communications.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is he knows it's a lie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, so do a lot of other people. And most of them, I give him a little credit here, most of them were afraid to tell Trump at the moment that it was a lie. He's clearly hinting at it. But even then, if you go to that last sentence of that page, he was still willing to push the big lie by saying, we need to reform voting integrity. So even though he knows it's a lie, he knows the election was what it was. And this is what a lot of senators and elected officials are doing. Even if they don't say, Trump lost, and more of them are actually saying Trump won, even the ones that haven't ever said Trump won, they're going with this last line, which casts doubt on the election and they do it knowing full well it's a lie. And you wonder why 70% or so of Republicans think it. It's because even the people, who know it's a lie, they won't say it, and they'll actually use weasel words like this that basically is going to keep all the big lie believers happy.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that the big lie and also the coronavirus vaccine controversy, all these scandals, these gaslighting scandals that have happened, have been, core to what Fox News has been doing and what OAN has been doing, and Newsmax as well. So it's really interesting to see that the committee is actually taking a look at that, and I think it's going to be a big part of their findings is how much of a gaslighting effort this was.
Agreed. And I'll just one other point.
Sure.
I was doing a little research today, given the Orban endorsement,
Mm-hmm.
and the parallels to Hungary should scare all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Orban controls the private media to a huge degree as well. This is exactly what he does. He's crushing the independent media, and he has sort of meetings and discussions like this to get his propaganda out. So even this bizarre and frankly disturbing relationship with Fox News comes right out of the playbook of autocrats like Orban.
Absolutely. This is exactly the territory we're going to be covering for the rest of this hour. I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking a little bit about Marjorie Taylor Greene and her being taken off Twitter, but also about Madison Cawthorn and the news we heard last week about him having that weird trip to St. Petersburg. It's a lot more of the same, but it also requires a little bit of investigation. So we're going to do that. We'll talk more about Hannity, and we'll talk about your book and how people can actually use the book to help save democracy on a state level. We'll talk all about that as we continue Narrative Tonight. This is the week that brought us the suspension of Marjorie Taylor Greene's Twitter account. Isn't that nice? A Twitter spokesperson said the company permanently suspended the account for repeated violations of our COVID-19 misinformation policy, which means she was lying about COVID. Greene still has access to her official congressional account at Rep MTG, which means she's not totally off Twitter. She's sort of half of Twitter because that's a personal account that they canceled. But her official account at Rep MTG is still there and is followed by 386,000 followers. So it doesn't mean we're going to be hearing the end of MTG, nor does it mean that Twitter is really to be taken seriously for its action here. But in all fairness, Marjorie Taylor Greene probably welcomes all of this. You see, for her, any attention is to her doing her job. She doesn't really have much of a job. She doesn't sit on committees. She doesn't do anything else. Her only job is to grab attention. And really, she's nothing more than a carnival barker for the gaslighting brigade. And for that, I did this really great little comparison between Carnival Barker on the left, Marjorie Taylor Greene on the right, and you can see they're even wearing the same wardrobe. Only she's carrying a Stop the Steal face mask, as one does when one's gaslighting a nation. But the net effect of MTG and the so-called Freedom Caucus is the debasement of our politics, and they're doing that in order to hide what's really going on. While they mostly play for the headlines of the gaslighting variety, there is a lot going on below deck at the HMS GOP, and today we're going to show you exactly what with our guest David Pepper, who has a terrific book out which will explain to you exactly what's happening in the heartland of America that is a real threat to democracy and is the real introduction of autocracy in the United States. And we'll tell you exactly what you can do to stop it. So you have to listen or watch the entire show. Now, 1 year ago this week, on January the 6th, the Freedom Caucus gaslighting became very real and also had very deadly consequences, as is now very well known. Congressional investigators tell Rolling Stone magazine that they are in fact investigating members of the Freedom Caucus. They didn't only pour fuel on the proverbial flames of the January 6th insurrectionists, they actually helped plan the event, including taking part in several meetings. They participated in these conversations or had top staffers join in, including Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Madison Cawthorn, Paul Gosar, Lauren Boebert, Mo Brooks, Andy Biggs, and Louis Gohmert of Texas. Now, this quote that's in Rolling Stone, I think, comes from Ali Alexander, who might be the source for the Rolling Stone magazine because he is cooperating with the investigators and he might have received immunity in exchange for being so honest and open about what happened. So here's the quote. "We would talk to Boebert's team, Cawthorn's team, Gosar's team, like back to back to back," the organizer told Rolling Stone magazine. Madison Cawthorn, of course, tells a lot of tall tales. Take, for example, his insistence that he trained for the Paralympics. That was a complete exaggeration. Or that he would be attending the U.S. Naval Academy. He, in fact, was rejected by the U.S. Naval Academy. He regularly tells supporters that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president, even though he acknowledged that Biden did, in fact, win the presidency when he did an interview on this on January 23rd last year. So Cawthorn knows how to spin a tale or two, and he knows how to get into a lot of trouble as well. Cawthorn spent one semester at Patrick Henry College, where multiple people have accused him of sexual harassment. So when Cawthorn announced that he and his wife of 8 months, Christina Bayardell, were getting divorced, it raised some red flags for me, as it did for many of you. And then came this interview with the Daily Caller, or a clip from an interview from the Daily Caller, in which he describes how they met. The first line is a killer.
It all starts in a Russian casino. And so I had a very large back surgery that was coming up. It was a reconstructive back surgery. It was a very dangerous procedure. And so because of that, we knew that I may be very limited in my life, or I'd be very freed from a lot of the pain I was dealing with. And so we took the risk to do that surgery. And so when I decided to do that, I said, well, doctor, let me go on one last trip just in case I'm not going to be able to ever get on an airplane again. And then so he said, okay, and you'll be in a lot of pain. I said, it's worth it. So me and a bunch of my friends, we went to we got to go over to very close to Russia. Went to Sweden and Norway, and we had just an incredible vacation. It was great. I was in a lot of pain the whole time, but it was wonderful. But then we got on a boat and went into St. Petersburg in Russia. And, we just decided to take $100 each and go into a casino and see how it went. And, I ended up meeting an American there who was a captain in the Army and who was originally from Miami. And so we hit it off, created a really great relationship, and stayed in contact for about a year and a half.
Let me pull up the transcript quickly there and just walk you through some of the first sentences here as he says. So me and a bunch of my friends, we went to, we got to go over to the, well, we were close to Russia. We went to Sweden and Norway, and we had just an incredible. This is the week that brought us the suspension of Marjorie Taylor Greene's Twitter account. Isn't that nice? Hear me now, can't you? Thanks, David.
Yeah.
So that goes on a little bit, and I apologize for cutting it short. But basically, it reveals that he goes off to St. Petersburg, and he's very tricky over there, trying to reveal where, in fact, he's going. I thought that clip where he's stammering for like 30 seconds about, was it Sweden? Was it Norway? Was it Russia? And finally he does reveal that it is Russia. I thought that was very interesting. He goes on, of course, to mention that he met this guy named Todd at this Russian casino. It seems to me pretty suspicious that he's just wandering into a Russian casino by accident. It seems like that would have been something he'd planned. It's not, it doesn't seem to me like something you'd accidentally do. Does it to you?
No, very strange, small world. I actually spent time in St. Petersburg in the 90s, back when we were kind of getting along, Clinton, Yeltsin. The idea that you just hop on a boat and go from Sweden and Finland to end up in St. Petersburg also sounds bizarre.
Well, you can't do it. I looked it up, by the way. It takes about 13 hours or 20 hours, depending on whether you take a train or a car. But it's a long trip. It's not one of these.
Yeah, I don't know
it's
the
not a day trip
now either. But back then it would have been a bureaucracy to do that if you hadn't already planned it ahead. I don't know the current rules. We're getting along with Russia worse now than we were when I was there, and you couldn't just get on a boat and show up. It's really bizarre.
The other thing about it is the timing.
We'll learn more every time he does an interview about this.
The timing's really interesting because this happened after his accident, which is 2014, but before he became the congressman for North Carolina, or at least the 11th District, North Carolina. So that's interesting because it must have been around 2017 that he went on his trip to Russia, which is after we all knew that Russia had already meddled in the elections in 2016. True. Which is a really strange time for someone to go who's an aspiring congressman to then go to Russia. I mean, it looks suspicious to me.
I mean, he must have seen that Flynn and others were all there, so so it made sense. But it's a terribly strange episode. And
then he meets this captain, and then comes back, and this captain a few months later decides to introduce him to this wife at a fake CrossFit event, which is also just bizarre. Why do you need a fake CrossFit event? What just happened to a blind date over dinner or something like that? So here he is picking up the rest of the story. And then we'll hear from you a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
And so we hit it off, created a really great relationship, and stayed in contact for about a year and a half until later I was down in Miami for work, and he texted me and said, hey, would you like to come compete in a CrossFit competition? And so I laughed and said, well, Todd, I'm in a wheelchair. I obviously can't do CrossFit. And he said, well, just do the pull-up section. I was like, okay, sounds good. And so I show up. But anyways, it all was a sham. It was a fake CrossFit competition. He just wanted me to put me in the same room with the girl who is eventually going to become my fiance. And so we did, and her and I hit it off, and it's been a magical relationship ever since.
Doesn't sound very real to me. All of it sounds ridiculously suspicious. In fact, he wasn't just even married to her for 8 months, as has been reported. He was actually married to her for a year. They had a secret wedding ceremony, not so secret because it was ultimately revealed by the press, but in December of 2020, and then a more public one in April, which is why we think it was only a 9-month wedding or marriage, but it was actually a year-long marriage. Lots of questions around Madison Cawthorn, and the thing which strikes me as being really weird about it is how close he is to Mark Meadows. And Mark Meadows keeps coming up time and time again in this January the 6th investigation. And I had no idea that even as early as 2014, and that Cawthorn used to work for Meadows at his local office in North Carolina. He was a special assistant there. So there's a lot to be learned, I think, still on what Madison Cawthorn was doing, both in Russia and on January the 6th, as they continue to investigate this.
Yeah, that's quite a tale. I mean, the fact, if all that's part of a lie and it's so convoluted, it scares me what the real story might be.
Right. I thought they were actually being quite smart by sort of getting in front of it, by admitting the fact that it was a setup. It wasn't a real CrossFit event, because that's, at least it's close to the truth. It might help them along there. But anyhow, my point behind running a little clip about the Madison and MTG and all of this gaslighting is that this is really part of the strategy. It really is what they're doing. The more you study them, and the more we live through the Trump era, every day, whether he's in power or not in power, he is trying to own the headlines. And they have a brigade of people in Congress named the Freedom Caucus that are there to do just that. They really have no other job. They haven't passed any policies of note, anything like that. They're just there to make a noise and to distract us from what the current administration, but also to distract us from what's going on in the middle of the country in the state houses, which brings us to your very excellent book. So tell us a little bit why, again, and you sort of started on this, but tell us again exactly what might be happening in the state houses that we're not noticing as consumers of the news on a national level.
Sure. I mean, we know that some are very alarmed about the attacks on voting rights. And there's a whole community that's really pushing the Senate, Joe Biden, to get that done. And a lot of them see the bigger picture. But overall, my worry is we are literally sort of micro-targeting each of the offenses to democracy. The attacks on protests. Well, we're mad about that. The attacks on the rigging of districts so you can never lose an election. In a lot of states, it's getting almost no coverage, but in Ohio and other states, the legislature is trying to change the rules of how judges are elected. In many states, elect their judges, or the jurisdiction of those courts, so they don't actually have an independent check on things like election laws they pass. Trying to rewrite history to censor out the parts they don't like, over and over. Attacking the way elections are run. It's all happening at one time. And as you said, that's part of the strategy. Throw everything at once in numerous states. Not all of it passes, but by the time you look up, a whole lot of it has. So this is bigger than a voting rights debate, although voting rights is maybe the core of it. This is about democracy itself, and it's about state houses. And we talked about this a little earlier. This sounds maybe, patronizing to a lot of people working hard in these state houses, but they really are the Achilles heel of American governance. No one knows who they are. Right. They're more susceptible to corruption, as most studies find. A lot of them never face a re-election, partly because they've rigged these districts. The media is so, hollowed out across the board, but where the price is really paid is coverage of state houses. And then a whole lot of elections. When you're watching an election on an even numbered year, you're looking for the presidential result, the congressional result, governor. Maybe the state house race gets a ticker at the bottom of the TV screen. Mm-hmm. But you never hear about that outcome if there even is a race. If you add it all up, this is where you can go better than anywhere else to really take a battle axe to democracy. And as I said earlier, they have the power. And this is I really appreciate your setup here. Madison Cawthorn and Boebert and all them, as bad as they've been, as dangerous as they were on January 6th, they haven't passed a single law. Mm-hmm. They're in the minority. Right. They're just talking. Some of them aren't even on committees. Marjorie Taylor Greene. There are hundreds of people like them who have the same views, who are equally wacky, who are in the majority in state houses, passing law after law after law, backdooring the very things they'd want to do if they could. And we're all focused on the latest crazy thing that Marjorie Taylor Greene has tweeted, or apparently she's now in a fight with that Crenshaw. Gosar is off the wall. While we're doing that, again, hundreds like them are passing these laws, and maybe we hear about a few of them, but we don't hear about most of them. And the reason I call the book Laboratories, they're all happening at the same time in all these states. These states are all learning from each other. Oh, that passed in Ohio. Let's do it here. Oh, that Dropbox ban made lines 2 hours longer. Let's do that here. So not only are they ramming them through, they are learning from each other, both the successes and the failures. So if some law got struck down, well, do it differently when you take it up in your state. So they really are operating as laboratories. And that's one reason why, you can't not fight for democracy even in a very red state, because that very red state could create the template that other states that are more of a swing state will then use. So anywhere you are, it's like soccer. My kid's 7 years old. Like, you learn very quickly. If one side's always on offense and the other side's always on defense, who wins? Well, they're on offense in 50 states. Every time if they pass a law, every other state studies it. And if they can, they pass it. And it goes on and on and on and on. All while we sit around and worry about Marjorie Taylor Greene's latest, workout video or something.
Right. It is interesting as well, and you point this out in the book, that the Democrats have been MIA in some of these red states for a long time. I mean, they're there in some sort of nominal fashion, but not really participating in the way the GOP is in these state-run houses.
Yeah, I mean, people are trying to catch up. Eric Holder put together an effort with President Obama in 20. But the other side's got a decades-long head start. They've been doing it for decades. They've got it. Again, it's not as if each state is doing this just on its own. They have national organizations where they train these people. They give them voter data. They give them model legislation. They in some fancy hotel room where they all want to visit. It's the nicest place a lot of them will ever go. And then they send them back to the state house and they pass it. It's not even a local law. Right. It's designed by some think tank that says, well, this worked in Georgia, do it in Ohio. So they're doing that while we're sort of slowly catching up. And again, we're decades behind and we have very little time left. But again, we'll go through it later, but there's also some opportunity. And one of the things I try and point out in this book, and I use Ohio and a few other states as case studies, the mode of governing with these basically undemocratic state houses is leading to atrocious public outcomes. Schools are cratering because they're being defunded. Everything's basically take money from the public and put it in the hands of the private players who are making this thing all run. So take money from public schools, stick it in for-profit charter school scams that many times are delivering horrible education and sometimes are criminal. Give big subsidies to energy companies paid for by taxpayers. Don't do infrastructure so small towns decay down to nothing. The point is, if you want to win in these undemocratic states, there is a lot of material of really poor public outcomes. In states like Ohio, we're proud of our state. It's unacceptable that our small towns are dying, and we should run on that. The reason you have a governor of Kansas who's a Democrat is because she ran on the fact that they had school 4 days a week. And Beto O'Rourke, he should run, and he is. They couldn't keep the energy grid going, so people froze to death. It's all a consequence of an undemocratic system where the incentive is not to actually create good public outcomes. It's to keep the private players who want access to that grid or want school money in their pockets happy, which means that the public suffers. So it's bleak. We don't have a lot of time, but politically and institutionally, there's also ways out if people get organized quickly.
And to be clear, this is being organized on a national level. I mean, you were talking about, the Council of National Policy or for National Policy, which Ann Nelson has been on the show talking about a lot here. There's a plan that they're executing, and it's partly got to do with the fact that at the end of the day, do they get a chance to rewrite the Constitution if they have the majority of state houses?
Yeah, I mean, they can do that. Here's the thing, which is, and Jane Mayer and others pointed this out in her book, Dark Money. What the big players have figured out, and this is sort of bad news for the political people, the system they have created has certain incentives. Serve private donors. Public outcomes don't matter. Be as extreme as possible. Then you don't have a primary. And undermine democracy so you never get challenged. And what we are found after 10 years, and it's been longer, but the last 10 years are really the most extreme it's been. The individual politicians actually don't even matter. They all behave the same way in response to the same incentive. So the Koch brothers and others, they don't care what happens to these people.
No.
If some guy gets busted for corruption, next up, someone else fills that seat and they start doing the same thing. Again, payday lending, for-profit schools. If some guy serves 8 years and gets a job somewhere, moves to Columbus, they don't care. The next person. So the truth is, the individual politicians actually don't even matter. They're pawns, and they all and the system. It's a nationals, ALEC, and others, and now more think tanks are getting involved, like Heritage. They create a system with certain incentives, and what they figured out is everyone behaves the same way in response to these incentives, and that's why it goes on and on and on. And one other point that people, I think, lose sight of, and I see it here in Ohio. That's one reason I wrote the book. I think people are continually shocked by what they see. And part of my book's point is to say, no, never be shocked again. And one of the reasons why it's so much worse than people appreciate is we are now at the tail end of a generation of state house leaders, almost every one of them, who themselves have never been in a democracy. Their elections have been guaranteed from their first moment in politics. Maybe they won a primary, won 7,000 or 8,000 votes. Some got appointed. Never again have they had a challenge. So they're living large without ever having to answer to the voters. They know it, and it makes them behave in a way that a lot are corrupt. Their public outcomes are terrible. They're more extreme. If there was ever a real democracy, they know they would lose. And so, but a generation who themselves have never been in an election, they're scared to death of democracy. They love the power they get in the current system. And by the way, one other thing, everything they have done in a system that lacks democracy would actually be kryptonite in a system of democracy. So when they have a chance to rig elections through gerrymandering or suppress the vote or attack courts that might stand up to them, they do all of it to keep themselves in power.
So what you're describing is that, in fact, parts of America are already autocratic and have been autocratic for a while, and that they are busy at trying to change the rest of us into being a lot more like them. And so we think about foreign threats, and we think about Russia, we think about Hungary, we think about all these other countries, but it's here, it's right next door in the states, in the red states, and it's questionable whether, there's very much that can be done about it at this point. But let's say there is. We'll go through that in a second. But the fact that we got here is kind of stunning. That we are already in a partial autocratic system here in the United States.
In America, and I don't want to speak to every country. In America, it's more dangerous that it's happening at the state level because those states have major power over the nation's democracy. So it maybe in another country, if some region had a bad government, it wouldn't matter. But here, they draw the districts so they can rig elections for the federal government and their own. They can set the rules, and they can set the electors in the process. So, by the way, this is something that while we're all waking up to it, if you go back to the founders, they knew this was a risk. They literally, Madison wrote, we are giving huge power, which part of the bargain? We're giving huge power to these state houses over the federal system. And they were worried still about the monarchy reappearing and backdooring through states. So they said, if these states ever become undemocratic, it risks our entire country. They wrote that, and they literally wrote in the Constitution a clause capturing that concern. It's called the Guarantee Clause, where it says, the United States shall guarantee a Republican form of government in every state. And by that, they meant small d democratic governance. To them, Republican form of government meant the people were sovereign. They reflected the will of the people. That was the revolutionary idea. So and I bring that up to say, if they watch the current Senate going on about, the filibuster rules, they would say, are you guys not reading the Constitution we wrote? We guaranteed that if states were under attack, their democracies were under attack, that the United States would stop it. So the idea that just because 50 of the people attacking democracy won't go along with the plan to stop their attacks, they'd say, well, you have your 50 votes, fulfill your oath to the Constitution, protect democratic governance in states. They explicitly worried about this, and they would say right now, this is what we warned you could happen. It was one other check and balance that they added to the system. And too often people just, again, against a constitutional guarantee, shall guarantee. That's as serious as it gets. A procedure like the filibuster is overwhelmed by that.
Right. And why is nothing being done about it then? Why is that guarantee exists? Why is no one doing anything?
Politics. But my hope is, and I'm an optimist, it's why I'm glad to be on your show. Like any forum any senator I've gotten, I won't name names, but I've sent this to any senator I know. I've sent it to my great Senator Sherrod Brown. I've written anything we can do, because I think some of them, and we can have debates all day about the filibuster, okay? Yeah. Some of them worry, well, if they do it here, they have to do it on everything. And the answer to that is, well, have that debate, but this is an issue that isn't some policy disagreement. It's not a budget matter. It's not a, other kind of matter. This is about the Constitution itself. And if you want to provide solid principled ground to carve out an exception in the filibuster, having a guarantee in the Constitution pretty much takes care of that. And so if you're worried about overdoing getting rid of the filibuster, if you're Joe Manchin, you can say, listen, this is the Constitution itself. It trumps everything else. I took an oath to it, so I can do this and still uphold the filibuster somewhere else. So my hope is this argument actually gives a way out to those who I think are worried about, the filibuster being used elsewhere. That's
although they did it to balance the budget or whatever it was, to raise the debt ceiling. I mean, they don't
they do it when they want to.
Yeah, so then they don't really. It's not really that issue for them. The issue for them is that they may actually like autocracy. They may actually be, they may like the system they've built.
The other way to look at all this, one is you take an oath to the Constitution, that trumps the filibuster, game over. The other is, and I don't claim to be a veteran, but I know enough to know you never want to fight asymmetrical wars. Here you have, at the state level, not one state, Republican state house, is consulting Democrats about the voting laws they're passing. They ram them through. Not one Democrat votes for it. And they don't care. They don't think twice about it. They're proud of it. But at the Senate level, these same Republicans insist on, well, we're the minority. You must respect our view. Well, no. In this case, if you really were serious about the minority view, you'd support this legislation because it's protect minorities in Ohio, in Michigan, in Wisconsin. So the very purpose of the filibuster, which is protect the minority view, in this case, is actually doing the opposite. It's protecting majorities in Ohio and all these states, running over the minority. They don't even write these laws in these states. They're written in some room somewhere in D.C. or some conference. There's no local input at all. And so that's an asymmetric warfare. Okay, you get to vote, and Chuck Schumer has said this the last couple of days, you get to ram through a tax on democracy on a pure party line vote, but Mitch McConnell says you can only protect democracy if we all agree, as if the people on the side attacking democracy are ever going to magically change their mind about what's happened.
Yeah.
And Democrats, we have a little bit of time, but I believe that any senator, but especially Democrats, who, if they stand in the way of protecting democracy in this 2-year window, that will be their legacy. And my kids who are going to sleep upstairs will be paying the price of their lack of courage and common sense in the face of protection of democracy. Just like, and again, it sounds dramatic, but the history is very clear. It's very clearly a pattern. It's just like the Great Compromise in the 1870s. The federal government stopped caring about the South. Jim Crow set in. And a young African-American, mid-20s, who at that moment would have had black mayors and legislators all around him for his entire lifetime, would never again see that, because the federal government, including people who knew better, cut a deal and wouldn't fight for democracy. I do not want 2022 to become 1877. That's the risk. And that's what's on the shoulders of these senators.
Yeah.
And I hope they see it that way.
I think, a lot of Americans see it that way. Certainly the viewers to this show view it that way. Whether the senators are going to, move, I don't know. But there is still a lot that people can do, especially on a state level, that maybe they haven't thought of, because your book is quite illuminating in this regard. It points us into so many different ways that people can use the state system to highlight all the injustices going on. I want to run through some of these. I'm going to run from 10 to 1. I don't know which order you'd like to go, and I hope that's okay.
Okay.
And I'm going to these may differ a little bit than the ones you had in terms of verbiage, but it's what I could fit in. So it starts with asymmetric warfare. So it starts with this idea that, why don't you explain what you mean by that? I actually just have. I don't know if you want to add it.
Yeah, to let one side play by one set of rules, and then they force you to play by the other, you just say no. You do what Mitch McConnell does. You just go do it. And here's the thing that I had a state house member who I know, who's a Republican, and we disagree on everything. He's somewhat infamous in the state house, but I've known him for 20 years. He tweeted at me after I said they must pass the Voting Rights Act. He tweeted, I put the chance of that at 0%. They're laughing. They are laughing at Democrats who don't stand up and fight. And my attitude on the asymmetric warfare, surprise them by how hard you fight. Make them stay all night, every day. They should have run all the way through that holiday vacation.
But you're talking about the Democrats in the Senate.
My
they're
God,
not going to do
I've never
it.
seen anything like this. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize. But the Democrats in the Senate are not behaving like this. It's not in their nature to do this. They're not suddenly going to discover this weird muscle that you're describing here.
Right. They need to.
Yeah. Well, they're not going to. I can tell you that we've tried.
Well, it's unacceptable. I mean, those Texas legislators left their homes, left the state because they were alarmed. Stacey Abrams, to great risk, she said, "I'm not going to be the governor," but she didn't concede. She called out the illegitimacy. One of the things that I put in this book is, and this is why the Orban conversation is so important, competitive autocracies rely on the sense that everything is legitimate. And so if you go along and act like it's legitimate, you're giving them the gift they want. Every U.S. senator, like Stacey Abrams did, like those Texas State House members, you need to say this is not legitimate, and your behavior should reflect that. And kind of being calm and saying, sure, you can have a filibuster without doing anything. To me, that's sending a signal that you don't think it's that big a deal. And I think it's a huge mistake.
But isn't that exactly what it feels like is going on? It feels like the Democrats, or at least some Democrats, have bought into some of the change that the Republicans might have wanted, and that they're not fighting as hard. It certainly seems to me like, a lot of the time they're putting up sort of a show, but they're not diving in there as much as they could. I know it's easy to say on the outside looking in when you've only got 48 real seats in the Senate,
right.
But it just feels like that.
In the last month of December, in the last month of last year, it was good to see a lot of Democrats actually saying, I think we should get rid of the filibuster.
Yeah.
More need to do that. And I agree with Chuck Schumer. Call the vote.
Absolutely. Call the vote on everything.
Just hiding behind, because I don't think it's just one or two. I think they're more. Yeah. And I think they let a few take all the heat. But and if you in the end aren't willing to do this, you're not for democracy. I'm sorry. And I say this to people who I respect. You are letting democracy die if you let this filibuster stand in the way of your constitutional oath to protect democracy in states. And again, you're also being played the fool.
Yep.
Mitch McConnell is laughing. The people in these state houses are like, wait, I passed my bill. I didn't even care what the Democrats thought. I didn't even talk to them. It was written in some conference room, and I passed it. But these fools in D.C. are going to sit around and require that Rob Portman and Susan Collins sign on. They're laughing. Yeah. And my attitude is, don't have them laughing. Have them shocked, because you fought harder for democracy than anything they've ever seen you fight for. And that's important for the other side to see. It's important for everyday citizens to see. Because if you act casual about it, the everyday citizens, the ones who aren't paying attention, are going to say, well, is democracy really in trouble if they don't even seem to act like it is? No, they're going to read from the casualness. And by the way, many senators are very fired about this. I don't want to minimize it. There are many. But as a group, it needs to be like, we don't need another speech. We need some passion and a little bit of anger and the same toughness that I hate to say Mitch McConnell shows.
Yeah.
He doesn't care.
He doesn't care. And, there's a lot of Republicans who can be shamed, maybe not a lot. There's probably one or two Republicans that can be shamed if they're concerned about their re-election opportunities, who can be shamed into voting for some of the stuff that they would otherwise not, because they're hiding behind Mitch and about, basically.
And let's be clear.
Yeah.
If you do a poll today, and one of the ththings this Freedom to Vote Act does is it creates a broader template of how many drop boxes you have per person. If you did a poll today, do you want more drop boxes in your state? The poll is 80-20. These are generally very popular things. Yeah. So these, as you said, I think you can move people. If we had a straight up vote in Ohio on changing the Constitution to end partisan gerrymandering. It passed 75-25, overwhelming. People don't, in what world do people like, rigged anything, let alone elections where politicians do whatever they want and can never lose. So the truth is, there are a lot of pressure points that you could hit hard on, but if you don't bring the argument, no one ever hears it.
Right. And maybe that's something just as the actual takeaway that people can take away from these points you're suggesting here. In your local state races, find the people that are vulnerable to this pressure, because there are pressure points. There's a lot of people who are going to lose their political careers if they don't sign on to some of these bills. We need to highlight that. And I think that there's an opportunity there to identify.
I don't know if it's in your group.
Yeah.
And even if they can't lose because they're in a district they cannot lose, still run against them and call them out every day for a year. Yeah. Because where they really win is when we don't challenge. They don't want a challenger. That's why they rig the districts. And when we don't run, they get to say whatever they want for 9 months. No one challenges them. So one thing we have to do is declare victory when people run in really tough districts and treat them like heroes for democracy that they are, and get them enough resources so they can point out all these things, as opposed to leaving them for dead because we have 5 swing districts we care about. We have to we have to broaden the conversation. Just make sure it's clear this is a long game. And if you run every year in every district, you're far better off than if you leave 30 out of 99 districts without an opponent, where they're mopping up and they're putting all their money into the swing districts.
Absolutely.
They've been fighting this game for decades, and we haven't. And it's one reason why we haven't made inroads.
Now, when you talk to people in the Democratic Party, they're saying that a lot of this money is already being allocated. Like the real money for next year is already, been spent. And in fact, we're not going to see a very much of a different strategy going into this next election cycle, which is why the predictions are so dire for Democrats.
Yeah. No, my worry is that is a potential reality. 2 things can fix that. One, there's a revolution in small dollar giving, and organizations, and I'm talking to a few who are thinking about this. If we can kind of create enough of a firestorm around democracy everywhere, every year, and say, give a little bit every month, and that'll let us support candidates in every district in Ohio, that can make a $20,000 campaign in a small rural district is a lot of money. It's a rounding error at a statewide, and it's not even in the conversation federally. So I think there's some power in digital, in online giving, small dollars monthly. But here's the other thing I'd say, if I ever had a room, and I've tried to get this to some of these donors, but I had a room with big donors, I'd say, listen, guys, take 6% of what you spend in the presidential, which is billions. And set it aside, and you'll find other resources for that presidential anyway. Take 6% of it and invest it in all 50 states every single year to run candidates, to build up voting registration operations. Sorry about my thing. You name it. And that money will go so much further. And by the way, you'll do better in the presidential race too, because you built something.
And I like what you're saying so much about this idea of creating a organization or a digital presence of some sort that allows people to find out where they should be adding their pressure points. Because I think people are very confused by the enormous challenge of trying to figure out which candidates are the right candidates, which issues are the right issues. Even on the voters bill, there's something really important there that can be done. I think just in terms of identifying who the most vulnerable senators might be. I mean, we don't know who those vulnerable senators are. You might have a better idea. Other people inside these, inside the Beltway might be able to have a better idea of who the more vulnerable people are. But people on the outside don't know. So if we had those names and we knew where we could send our $20 bills, that might be more effective in terms of getting us through that.
Yeah.
I really love that idea.
One thing I want to say is sometimes, and this is going to sound counterintuitive and maybe pie in the sky, but even if the person isn't the best candidate, like, put it this way, Democrats are waiting for Barack Obama and Stacey Abrams to save us. Republicans put people in seats everywhere and say, go win, and they win, and they're in power. So we have to say to anyone who will step up, especially in the hard districts, you are a hero. And we are raising enough money through small dollar donations that when you start your campaign, you're not going to have 6 figures, but you're going to have enough to get your name and message out. And do that as many states as possible, knowing, by the way, that most of you are going to lose. But running is a big part of winning. Running everywhere means you win somewhere, means you force them to share resources and not only go after the 5 swing seats. Virginia was a great example. And so in my book, it's not just pie in the sky. I go through case studies. The Virginia General Assembly was gerrymandered in 11, like everyone else. And 2 straight elections, they ran everywhere in 17 and 19. They ran many more candidates than Republicans. They picked people who knew their community. They had a diverse group of candidates. And over those 2 cycles, they defeated the Republican gerrymander. In Ohio, we didn't flip a single district for 6 years after the gerrymander. In 18, first year we had candidates in all 99 districts. We flipped 6.
Interesting.
You got to run everywhere. And you have to have, again, don't overpromise, underdeliver. But you have to have a conversation with these candidates where you say, you are part of the big team of democracy, and you are stepping up. And by the way, if you don't win, maybe run again. About 3 of the 6 people I mentioned who won in 18, they ran in 16 and lost. They kept running. just like Stacey Abrams, perfect example. She knows this is a long game. So she didn't win her governor's race, and there was a whole lot of voter suppression that happened. Did she quit? No, she actually, the night of that speech, she said, "We made progress." A lot of people probably thought, really? Well, who was right? She was, because every door knocked on, every voter registered, everyone fired up, kept going. They're now on your database. And lo and behold, 2 years later, Georgia's blue. So we've got to redefine this as a battle for democracy, not a battle over swing states and federal elections. And we've got, once we define it that way, the teams change. Embrace Republicans who actually support democracy. There are not many left.
Yeah,
but
no, there are. There are people. There are plenty out there.
They are there. Define it as a long game, so you don't go home and cry every time you don't win every 2 years. But if you built something, keep building, and you got to do it all over. You can't just pick 10 states and say the rest of you, we're going to allow you to live without democracy. And I mean, again, that's a violation of the Constitution. No one in any state should live in a state that isn't a functioning democracy. We don't want that in the world. Why would we let it happen in states in America?
Absolutely. So there's a guarantee about that. And of course, the House is just on a knife's edge in the next round. I mean, any number, just a handful of seats could flip the House in one way or another, and that would change the trajectory of history. You also said here, this is number 9, prioritize democracy above everything else. So tell us a line about that.
Yeah. I mean, if you can break bread with someone who you disagree with on other issues, do it. And that sounds naive in 2022. Reagan and Bush both signed the Voting Rights Act. Though the Senate passed the Voting Rights Act in those years, something like 97 or 98 votes. It wasn't that long ago that this was bipartisan. Right. I'm not naive, but there are some Republicans, and some of them have left the party, others are quiet, who I think still believe in democracy. And I think we have to embrace people we disagree with. And that also means moderates, to the extent they support democracy, and progressives also go fight about other things. But if you're on the same page of democracy, that's even more important. One last thing, and this is really important, and it's sort of counterintuitive. I think, although I get it, and it was amazing they would beat Trump, defining the other side as never Trump is far too narrow. The attack on democracy preceded Trump. It will continue, and the powers of these states will continue if Trump doesn't run in 24, if he's not around 5 years later. What they are building is about democracy. Just like I say in the book, Andrew Johnson was controversial. He didn't support the South. It'd be like saying you have a never Andrew Johnson movement instead of a never Jim Crow movement. Right. We are defining it too narrowly. And what that has done is and I think this is part of what happened in 20, it gave a lot of Republicans who didn't like Trump a license to vote for Republicans the rest of the way, even though those Republicans, although they didn't feel like Trump, they were more civil than Trump, they're against democracy just like he is. They're just more savvy about it or quiet about it. So I think every single voter who cares about democracy needs to say, even if you don't like Trump, I don't care. Are you for democracy?
I love that, especially because we've seen that. We've seen these Republicans destroy democracy in the middle of this country, as you point out. Let's call them out on that all the time. They shouldn't be able to go through an election cycle without every day this being reminded of them.
And even if they're genteel, and even if they, some of these goofballs walk the Edmund Pettus Bridge and send photos out. Yeah. And then they say the Voting Rights Act would federalize elections. That was the whole damn point, folks. So if you see people doing that, don't think never Trump. Well, that guy seems okay. He's against democracy. Never vote for him. Get him out of office. Yeah,
and almost every Republican in office in the state houses is against democracy, as they are in the federal houses. So you've also said here, expose election corruption. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but it's not really, because we don't spend enough time saying where the votes are rigged and looking at it and highlighting where the rigging is happening, because it's happening everywhere and it's systemic.
You got to call it out. One of the ways I think about this is election night in America is literally like a holiday. We have panels of CNN and MSNBC. We have special music we all can recognize, and we all watch it. And this is what competitive autocracy wants. It legitimizes everything, and that's fine if these were fair elections. There should be as much coverage right now over the rigging of congressional districts. Put the panel up, play the fancy music. Tonight they determined, 13 races in Ohio out of 15. They just determined those. So we don't all sit around next year and somehow act as if it was a surprise. So I think we all still are so excited to believe in our unique democracy that we're unwilling to call out where it's flawed. And that's why I think we need to be much more clear cut on not everything's broken.
Yeah.
But where it is broke, some of the stuff they're seeing on the other side is obviously absurd. But rigging elections so you and I can brick 99% of state house races in Ohio for 10 years, that should be front page above the fold.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
Much
there,
more
just not
so-
covered. It's just not covered.
Yeah,
I mean, it might
much
get a
more than
mention in the local newscasts,
on
but
the
it doesn't
election
get.
itself.
Yeah, exactly.
So we all sort of play into it, and it legitimizes, which is what they want.
Well, the local news story that is another one of your points that will come to, but the fact that local newsrooms have been bankrupted of any real journalism, and the fact that local TV stations no longer really function as local TV stations, this is tragic, because there's no one actually on a local level looking at what's going on in terms of these election, the gerrymandering and the rigging, and and there are people who are capable in each of these states who can get on the internet, because we now have the capability to do shows like this, who can get the word out. And I hope people listening tonight, wherever they might be in America, if they encounter these kinds of efforts to rig the vote or change the vote, gerrymandering, that are not getting the limelight that they deserve from journalists, that they put it out themselves. You've got your phone, you've got your Twitter accounts, record something, put something out, express to the world what's going wrong in your area, because you are the local media there now. There is no.
That's literally why I wrote the book. Yeah. I was sitting around tweeting something, and I thought, I shouldn't tweet this. I need to write this.
Yeah.
And if you look at now, I'm sure my wife is wondering what the heck's happening to my husband, but almost every day I do a whiteboard, which gets viewed a lot, 50, 60,000 views, sometimes more. It's my effort to just inform people. Like it may seem desperate, but I don't see enough else out there. If people follow me on Twitter, they'll see all this stuff at David Pepper. But yeah, we all need to get it out there. And what's happening with journalism is exactly that. I mean, they are being, and it's a perfect situation for, again, Alec, the Koch brothers, because as I said, this is about, I call it the 80-20 rule in my book. Throw everything at the wall, and 80% of it may not pass.
Yeah.
But 20% will. They'll cover the 80%. They may not even get to the 20, but throw out. It's kind of like what you said. The fake news or the Madison Cawthorn story. They'll throw some crazy idea out there. It gets all the news coverage. It gets crushed by the legislature in the end because it did get exposed. In the meantime, they passed 3 other things that never were in a story.
Yeah.
So
this is what they're doing. That's the strategy.
They know there's limited coverage. And by the way, one other thing, and this is going to sound really in the weeds. Who do you cut in journalism when you're running out of money? You cut the columnists and the ed boards, the people with some institutional history that can cut through the clutter and explain that's the most ridiculous map of all time. Straight news have to generally do both sides. So you also are seeing the long-term, shoe leather, more expensive, more senior reporters be the first to go. And that ends up meaning that any kind of neutral analysis disappears, and all you get is Fox News or tweets from one side or the other. So there's a lot of tendons being cut in the media beyond just the fact that these papers are a lot smaller.
And especially the investigative teams, which is where a lot of this stuff comes out of. Those are the first to go. A lot of these newsrooms are just gutted. They have nobody in them. They have no journalists.
Yeah.
They print papers, but they have nobody in them. Really.
Yeah. I mean, in Ohio, I'll give credit. We still have some really good journalists, and they do a good job. But if I talk to them candidly, they're like, we're overwhelmed. We're exhausted.
Yeah.
We can't keep up with every new iteration of this horribly rigged map. And these are the people who've been around a long time. So no, it's, the average state house, one study found, has 3 reporters per state house. That is literally a dream of those who want to take over state houses and do undemocratic things.
And it does take time and experience to work through those institutions and know what's what. You can't just throw these rookie reporters in these situations. But I think this idea that, people are empowered. They have their phones, they have their video cameras, they can pop up anything that they find and they can put it up on Twitter. It's so powerful when some of these things get sent around and become viral, as you point out. And I think that it can build a movement and also empower people to do something at a unique time.
By the way, one other thing, don't go around the paywall. If there's a paper that's doing good state house coverage, subscribe to it.
Yes.
Reward those things that lift democracy.
Yes.
And
the
if
stuff that's available for free isn't great.
We save $1.99 a month by signing on to a different computer or whatever. You are undermining democracy. If you want good state journalism, local journalism, if it's a nonprofit, support it. There are more nonprofit newspapers popping up. If it's a good in-state journalism with someone covering that state house, subscribe to it.
Right. Let's get back to the list here because we're going to run out of time. So contest every district. This is so important. I had no idea that not every district in this country was contested. Why not? Why is it happening like that?
Because it's really hard. And this is where the conversation is a tough one. this district was designed for you to lose really badly. And you're going to have to take a lot of time to do this. And so if it's only about whether they win or lose that election, a lot of serious people who have lives to lead and kids to raise aren't going to do it. You need to broaden the conversation. Democracy is in the balance. When they rig districts, it's so they have a monopoly on the conversation in 2/3 of the state of Ohio. You running is a heroic act of democracy, and we are there to help you get your message out. And if you don't win, the fact that you ran, we're going to celebrate. And anyone who wins because you ran, you were part of that victory. So if 99 people ran for the state house in Ohio, it would really help Tim Ryan win a Senate seat.
Right,
my hope is some of them would win too. It's a team sport. And I've seen some amazing.
It's more working up ballots, not down ballots.
Yeah, up both ways. I've seen, we had some great congressional candidates in the last couple of years, veterans, pilots, valedictorians of Ohio State, for example. They didn't win, but the lift that their operation brought the turnout elected some of those state reps. And those wins were partly their wins. So you've got to say it's a team sport. And after the election, if they lost, if they want to stay involved, don't let them go anywhere. And in the past, too many sort of party folks, they walk away, they celebrate the 5 wins. It's hard to lose. I've lost. It's, you got your family there. You've asked them to do everything. You got to buck these people up and say, you were part of the long game. Think about the women's suffragists and John Lewis and how they knew it was a long game for generations. And we quit after one cycle. We have to redefine it as a long game for democracy. And anyone who steps up to run needs to be treated accordingly.
Well said. That's really good. Very powerful stuff. The question here is, why aren't well-funded national progressive groups funding ads, grassroots efforts to promote lobbying of recalcitrant senators for voting rights and filibuster reforms? We sort of covered that, but
my guess is you'll probably see that when we get closer. I mean, there are a lot of groups very passionate. There's a lot of passion in the party for this, and I think we probably will see that. I hate to say it, I'm not sure how effective ads are. I think it might alienate as much as it helps, but I do think phone calls from real live people in these states really matter. And by the way, not just to the senators who are on the fence, but I would call senators who are on the right side and say, I want you to be more loud on this. I don't see from you a sense that this is as urgent as it is. And that's giving other people in your Senate a license to not do what they need to do. So, I mean, we've seen moments, Nancy Pelosi, Wendy Davis, where she stood in Texas for hours.
Right.
I want that. I'm a good friend of Cory Booker. Cory Booker stood for 20 hours and did that. Right. And he's the kind of guy who would. Only acting that way will wake people up to how bad it is.
I think you're so right. And I think just the president,
Kevin McCarthy, the one who spent hours talking. Why aren't we the ones doing that? I mean, why is Kevin McCarthy, seem more passionate about what he's doing? Our officials need to not just be on the right side, but need to fight for it. Again, harder than anything they've ever fought for.
And the public can play a role in this. The public can really step up and and find the pressure points. If we all knew the pressure points, it would be easier. But if we don't, we'll find out quick enough. If there are things that are beginning to bubble, let's find them. Let's increase the pressure on those big issues, and let's see if the senators
and by the way, give them and understand where people are coming from. That's why I mentioned the guarantee clause. I believe some of these senators are worried about other votes that they think the filibuster will help them on because they actually don't agree with other Democrats. So with those senators, I'd say that's a different debate. That's a different issue. This is democracy. And with democracy, the Constitution tells you what you have to do. And that's a clear exception based on principle that allows you to separate the other issues that you don't agree with. And so I do think not just hitting everyone over the head, although that can help too, but with some of them, get them the arguments that if you think they are legitimately struggling, get them the arguments that they can grab hold. I was in office. I get this. Hey, I want to get to where I need to get, but I don't want to open a door to something else. Help people find their way if you sense that there is some room there.
It's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of these lawmakers assume that they're not going to win in the future, that their party's not going to be in power, and then the filibuster is going to be used against them. I mean, that's sort of going in with the worst mindset you could possibly imagine. We have to go into the mindset of winning.
Yeah, we learned in the Trump era, if nothing else, you learned you never cave to bullies, ever. Then they've got you. That mindset is caving to Mitch McConnell.
Right.
He's a bully. You think, well, if we do this and he's going to do that, so we can't do it.
Yeah.
He's going to do it anyway on the things that Mitch McConnell cares about.
Absolutely.
He's going to do it anyway. And by the way, most of what he needs done is happening at the state level. So he doesn't need a bunch of state Senate laws to pass anyway. He's getting everything he needs through state laws and judges that he doesn't have a filibuster for to uphold those things. He doesn't care about the other stuff. Mm-hmm. And so you're letting him win, but you're showing him that you're willing to be bullied because you're scared of what he might do. Yeah, I never see Mitch McConnell looking like he's afraid that if he did X, we might do Y in 3 years. It's a losing mindset. It's frankly why the Republican Party lost their party, Donald Trump. They got bullied for 6 years. Look what happened to them. So why would we not learn the lesson and let ourselves get bullied?
Absolutely. I think the mindset is so important. And for whatever reason, I love people like Cory Booker who have a real spiritual and soulful sort of presence when they sell their platforms. And I think that people like that need to really stand up at this time, because I think that there's
my prediction is you'll see some of that. I mean, I think some of them are getting more frustrated. I think they're being quiet because they want their colleagues to come along. And I think you're going to see at one point when the vote is called, you're going to see. I think it needs to come sooner. I mean, it's easy for me to say this. I know all the pressures in the White House. I would have done this first. I would have gotten it done. And to put it behind
the Voters' Rights Bill, or
voting rights. Get it done.
Yeah.
Because the longer it goes, we saw this with 2010 and 9. Once you get behind other things, those things get negotiated. Next thing you know, you're in March or April. They're running the ads, and it never happens. And again, if you don't do it because you're passing other bills, you're literally making a compromise against democracy. And the lesson, again, going back to 1877, if you are trading that you get other positive things, be the economic or other, and in that trade you're saying, therefore we won't push democracy, you are going to lose.
Absolutely.
And never trade for democracy.
Absolutely.
And
that's so much sense.
I think by pushing it back, they made a trade. We'll do these things and then we'll get to this. No, you don't do that with democracy, especially by March and April when you saw how extreme these state houses were getting, amplifying the big lie and then passing all these laws, let alone the new election rigging.
And we have no memory, it seems. We have no memory of how bad Donald Trump really was. And that was a lukewarm version of what we might get in the future. I mean, the first term of Donald Trump was him being nice. I mean, what's going to happen in the next term of a autocratic leader? It's not going to be anything that anyone would want. And people have forgotten that. And because it's of that distance in time, maybe it's lost some of the fire. And maybe all of us need to be re-energizing around how traumatic and devastating and awful Trump was, and how it will get much, much worse if the GOP wins next year.
Let me just make it even worse for you. Other people are more dangerous than Trump. The system they're setting up in states will benefit whoever runs.
Absolutely.
And Trump was so incompetent on COVID, and he tweeted so much. I think someone else actually could have run a much better campaign and not turned off those voters.
Absolutely.
And so my worry is a brighter, less insane person than Donald Trump, who sees the levers in all these state houses and pulls them. This is what Orban does, and is savvy about it and is smarter about it than a guy who in the end didn't have enough self-control. So, if someone else had stepped up and really taken on COVID, they could have had a much stronger reelection campaign. So I worry about, this is why I say it can't just be about never Trump. It's about institutions across this country preparing, this trigger that whoever is potentially running in 24, 28 or whatever is going to go benefit from. And that's something that's unique here versus, other strongman type governments. Putin runs everything. Orban runs everything. In America, these state houses run a lot of everything.
Right.
And their work could actually inure to benefit of a lot of people beyond Donald Trump. And in some ways, I bet the Koch brothers might look back and think, sheesh, I wish someone a little smarter had actually gotten in there, because they would have been able to take more advantage of everything they're given through these state houses than even Trump, who in the end had no self-discipline. Yeah,
I mean, it's certainly, you look at people like DeSantis who are lining up, and he's no Donald Trump. He's much savvier. He knows how to play the media, and he knows the strings to pull. And I think people like him are very dangerous, obviously, for democracy.
And everything's in place for them to take hold of.
Yeah. So you talk about competing in all 50 states. You sort of mentioned the competing in every district, but what about the 50 states? It's sort of where we started, but just to wrap it all up, how important are are the individual states that are more important than others, and where should we be focusing our attention?
I mean, one, I think it's as I said earlier, if you told every donor, let's take 6 or 8% of your presidential spend and divide it up across 50 states and use it at elections at all levels, they'd say you're crazy. And you know what you'd say back? It's what the Koch brothers did. It worked. That's what they did.
Interesting.
They decided that they could afford to, because they cared about attacking democracy, and they obviously profit from all this. So there's a little bit of a difference in incentive. But they made that bet in 2010. And on budgets that are quite small, they flipped a lot of state houses, including Ohio's. Democrats were the majority state house in Ohio in 2010. And they flipped it. They flipped them all over. And so you need to fight everywhere. You can't, if you only go to federal swing states, maybe you win, maybe you don't, but you're letting them off the hook. Look at what Republicans did. New Jersey, Virginia were blue. They didn't sit back and say, well, forget those states. We're only going to focus on reds. They went right after it. They knock out a governor who we thought would win. They almost win New Jersey. Yeah. They don't think about, in one way, I put this in the book. If you look at that map, there's a network of think tanks that are conservative policy think tanks. If you push, it's called the State Policy Network. If you put your arrow on your computer over Hawaii, they have one there. If you put it over Vermont, they have one there. They are pushing this battle everywhere because they know that, again, if we're only in some states and they're in every state, long term, over time, they'll pick up Missouri 10 years later. Missouri was a close state not long ago. Obama won Indiana. If every time they win a state, they put it in their back pocket and we give up on it because we only stick with certain swing states, they're always gaining, and we're getting a narrow playfield. So the good news is we do have a demographic advantage. So some states, Georgia, and this is why they're being so intense about suppression, Georgia, Virginia, we're seeing changes. Trump alienated suburban women. By the way, again, not everyone may have that problem. So there are things that are helping us, but they play for keeps everywhere.
Right.
And we need to start competing every single state.
Yeah, and they're aggressive on policy. I mean, some of these, these policies that they make up are, very effective, as we saw in Virginia, with the critical race theory and the like. I mean, they're able to ignite issues that the Democrats just don't operate in that way. They don't have that muscle, that muscle to do that. Yeah. And it's so important to gain that, especially in these next 10 months, although there's plenty to work with. Just bring us back to where we started the show with this idea that these, this caucus of gaslighters are out there trying to distract us from what's really going on. How do people find out what's really going on? Where, the shows like mine, but where else is there a place that you go to? This is going to
sound horribly self-serving.
Yeah.
Please read the book. The book goes through this in a way that it's weird to say, it's painful how bad it is. It as much as you think you know how bad it is, the book will make it feel worse. But then it takes a turn and says, and here's what you can do about it. But I believe until people wake up to how bad it is, they're not going to do what needs to be done. I will say, I want to mention a few. John Avlon is on CNN. He's actually covering this very well. I give him a lot of credit. I've been on the show. He's gotten into some of the details about Ohio's gerrymandering. Some of the MSNBC folks do as well. So there are people doing it. The New York Times had a big story a few weeks ago on it. So it's starting to come around. But I think that a lot of it is on social media, shows like yours, and I, follow me on Twitter. I try and get it out there. One of the things I'm hoping to do is I do have a website, laboratoriesofautocracy.com. And I've asked people to sign up there. And, I don't know if you've written a book, but you never know what's going to happen. But if there's enough energy behind what I've written, my hope is to use that website, laboratoriesofautocracy.com, to inform people about things that are happening that are quite bad, but also what are things that people are doing that are really good that you should emulate.
Yeah, exactly.
And so
it's so
my hope
important
is to do that. And so if you go to the website, you can sign up. And my hope is to this year think through ways to do that, as much
even
as
just
I
that
can.
weekly newsletter from you would be really useful for people.
Yeah.
That's laboratoriesofautocracy.com, right? That's the website.
That's the website. Yeah.
People can also find you on Twitter by going to @DavidPepper. That's correct.
Yeah. And I just started a YouTube channel, David Pepper for Ohio. Okay. My email is davidpepper4ohio@gmail.com. People can go to YouTube, where I also have those videos if they're on YouTube. But the videos are all 2 minutes, and I didn't know what would happen with them. But I did a video on what happened in the 1800s, the one that feels like old history.
Yeah.
Viewed more than any other by far. 330,000 people. Why? Because they never knew that we had a functioning democracy in the South before Jim Crow set in. So the history and the policy, I try and go through in ways that people might not have confronted before.
I love all that. It's certainly one of the reasons we started Narrative, was to bring some context in terms of history to the current events. And it sounds like you can do a lot of that too on your YouTube channel, which is called, to say the name again, the YouTube channel.
It's just my David Pepper for Ohio.
Okay. Well, everyone's going to check all that out. I'm sure our audience will be very supportive of you. We will continue, hopefully, to cover these things, and hopefully you'll come back on our show. David, it's been really terrific having you here. And maybe you need a show of your own on Narrative so we can get more of your information out there and more of your activism out there. It's a really eye-opening.
Oh, it's been great. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. There's no Narrative tomorrow night, but there is one on January the 6th, and you'll know why. So we'll see you then, and then the after show will be back on Friday. Thanks for being here on the first Narrative of 2022. Looking forward to a great year with you guys. Have a good night. Narrative is made possible by viewers like you. Join today and support truly independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. That's patreon.com/narrative.